My name is Garisch. I'm a medical doctor and an author and a founding member of the Life Writing Collective, which is a non-profit organization which helps people to write about their life experiences, to debrief from trauma, to grow confidence and communicate more effectively. There are many benefits to regular creative practice. It's not something to hand over to the professionals or to dismiss as a hobby or pastime. This is a birthright that you can use to make your life more curious, more effective, less anxious. This is what this talk is about. It was originally given to my colleagues, doctors, and now I'm adapting it for YouTube. So when I was training as a doctor, the artistic practice was not on the agenda. We didn't think that regular creative practice was useful for well-being. But luckily I'm born into this time of the medical humanities movement, where the arts and the social sciences are talking to the health sciences about well-being. I've had my own anxiety and chronic illness to deal with, and although medical practice has helped me, regular artistic practice has also hugely helped my health and well-being. I want to start with a poem written by a doctor, and we'll recognize things in this poem that apply to our friends. Certainly in the consulting room, we see a lot of people who don't act in their own best interests. And we've got to get curious. This lecture was originally given, talk was given originally to my medical colleagues to illustrate how helpful regular creative practice can be to help us understand ourselves and to change our habits of thought and behavior. So in this poem, Glenn Colquhoun, who's a New Zealand doctor, illustrates some of the difficulties we find in the consulting room, but in life in general, and doctors are often their own worst culprits. Today I do not want to be a doctor. Today I do not want to be a doctor. Nobody is getting any better. Those who are well are sick again, and those who are sick are sicker. Those dying think they will live. The healthy think they are dying. Someone has taken too many pills. Someone has not taken enough. A woman is losing her husband. A husband is losing his wife. The lame want to walk. The blind want to drive. The deaf are making too much noise. The depressed are not making enough. The asthmatics are smoking. The alcoholics are drinking. The diabetics are eating chocolate. The mad are beginning to make sense. Everyone's cholesterol is high. Disease will not listen to me, even when I shake my fist. So the question is, if behavior is so hard to change, and we know it is, are we using the wrong tools? We've been using facts and logic. You know, the surprising thing is you can put all facts and logic in front of somebody and they will not change the way they are self-destroying. We know that from ourselves, we know this from our friends. Perhaps, they're surprisingly unhelpful. Perhaps narrative and image are more helpful in helping us understand our motivations, our compulsions, our obsessions, and our behavior. So the thing is that we get trapped in, when there's uncertainty, and in this time of the pandemic and the virus, uncertainty is a huge issue. It's amplified everything. When we're faced with anxiety and uncertainty, we can get very anxious. That is normal. But the anxiety can get us trapped into hope and fear. I hope I'm going to stay well. I'm scared I'm going to get sick and die. I hope I'm going to stay employed. I'm fearful that I'm going to lose my job. And we get stuck in this one narrative of that can happen or that can happen. And it doesn't help. It's, that's the thing that keeps us awake at night, that makes us ill, actually, because those kind of anxieties, they play on your physiology and make you ill. The question is, can we change that hope-fear trap into curiosity? Because actually we don't know. We know this from life. We don't know what's going to happen next. Life is much stranger than our imaginings. So Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is a Nigerian writer, and when she went to America, she discovered that there was one story about Africa, that her housemate, when she was in college, thought that people in Africa, there were lions in the street, and there were starving children all over the place, covered with flies. And she's got this wonderful TED talk called "The Danger of the Single Story," that Africa is this massive continent with many, many stories. But I think that her point doesn't just apply to nations, it applies to ourselves. We've got one story about our lives, and that traps us. How can we use creativity to break open that story and consider that we have many stories inside us, to have that expanded view, that curious view? We don't really know enough about who we are and where we're going and what to do about it. Eric Kandel is a prize-winning neuroscientist, psychiatrist, and professor of biochemistry and biophysics. And he's written this brilliant book called The Age of Insight, where he looks at the turn of the century into the 1900s in Vienna, where people were starting, the scientists and the artists were starting to look at what lies beneath. We've got the story on top, but what actually lies beneath? So the artists were starting to paint what the human being, the motivations of the human being. So the self-portraits didn't look realistic anymore. They depicted trauma and sexuality in ways that before that time were, certainly in the recent past in Europe, had not been depicted. Same with psychology. It was a time where people started looking at people's motivations, and the health scientists were looking down microscopes and discovering that we were made up of cells, and there's spermatozoa in semen, and we didn't know about all these things beforehand. So there was this huge inquiry, and at that time the scientists and the artists were talking to each other in very fruitful ways. So in his book, he points out that there are two parts of the brain, two ways to solve problems. And the one is logical, sequential, deductive, analytical, interpretive, and employs judgment. The logical brain breaks the problem down into parts to arrive at a solution, tries to eliminate paradox and contradiction, and is goal-driven and is limited to drawing on what we already know. That's the interesting thing about using the factual, logical brain, that we actually can't get past what we already know. Whereas the other brain process for solving problems finds solutions by juxtaposing elements that make emotional sense, even if they contradict each other. It is capable of perceiving the overview, is non-judgmental and process-driven, has instantaneous insights, the aha or eureka moment, and draws on unconscious information. So how do we shift from the habits of thinking in a logical, judgmental, interpretive, measurement kind of way? Because that's what we're trained in. That's what our society trains us to do. It's the whole hierarchy thing. You're either on top or you failed. So there's another psychologist, James Hollis, who has some interesting ideas about this. In his book called The Middle Passage, he talks about anxiety management plans, which we put in place very early on in our lives. It's normal to feel anxious. It's normal to feel uncomfortable to move away from the discomfort. Even a unicellular organism will move away from an environment where the pH is too high to one where it's lower, or a small animal will go from a place where it's too hot to a place where it's cooler. We do this as a survival mechanism. We do it for physical survival, but we also do it for emotional survival. That if something makes us uncomfortable, we will put something in place to make us feel better. Some of those habits of thought and behavior are helpful to us, and some are harmful. So he describes certain anxiety management plans which are very common in our society, and here are a few of them. We turn to alcohol, we turn to food, we turn to work, shopping, even for things we don't need, don't want, that end up in the trash, out in the ocean, destroying the environment. The internet, smoking, music can be very, very soothing, both listening and making music, exercise, sleep, rage. If you kick the dog and shout at people, it may make you feel better in the moment. It might make everyone else miserable, but it's an anxiety management plan. Gardening, the art, and all the arts can be helpful to soothe us. The question is, it's useful to sit and think about, what are my anxiety management plans? What do I put in place when I feel uncomfortable or even freaked out? is the short-term relief I'm getting from the thing that I'm doing, the habit of thought and behavior, does it give me short-term relief? Am I swapping that for long-term disaster? Or is the short-term relief actually building on something that gives me long-term relief as well? So the good news is that if you have anxiety management plans that are self-destructive, change is possible. C.S. Lewis has got a wonderful quote, the author: "You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending." This is Louis Cozolino, who's a psychologist who talked about change and creative engagement in his book, The Neuroscience of Psychotherapy. And he says that an individual's capacity for change is dependent on his or her ability, these three things, but you can break them down even further. So he says you need to be able to catch the moment where you're feeling anxious or have some discomfort. And that can be harder than you think. You know, often we've eaten the whole chocolate bar and we haven't even realized that we're feeling anxious. You know, where did that go? But if you can catch that moment where you're feeling anxious and then withhold from your usual anxiety management plan, which means that you're going to start feeling more anxious, which you got to be able to tolerate that feeling of increasing anxiety without knowing what's going to happen next for long enough for new neural pathways to grow in the brain. So this is where creative practice can be immensely helpful, because you've got that gap between the perception, then there's this big feeling going on, and then the acting out. Where you have that big feeling of anxiety, increasing anxiety, because you're not going your usual go-to place, you're not going to go there. You can take it to the clay, to the collage, to the dance, you can take it to music, you can take it to writing and express it as you find it in your own body. And that allows the process, it gives a space between the perception and the reaction to process what is happening to you. And in that space, you will also find out more about your own habits and tendencies around your own anxieties. What happens in these moments where we get anxious is that you have an event out in the world, you perceive it through your senses, you make associations in your brain, you then interpret what is going on, you then react to what is happening. So the role of the artist is to take back that process to the point of perception before you've had the associations and the interpretation, or you can work with the associations that you're making with that perception and understand them better so that you're not knee-jerking into your usual response. You might have had a man with a moustache who hit you when you were young, like a teacher or something. And now every time a man with a moustache walks into the room, you have this reaction. You don't even know you're having it. You've already written the script because you have this reaction, and he noticed your reaction, and then you both start behaving weirdly, and you've written your own script. So going back to the original perception and exploring what a man with a moustache means to you can unhook or uncouple or help you understand your own thought habits and behavioral habits, and then your relationship habits as well. So one way of looking at this is that where you have habits of thought and behavior, looped behavior, it's your usual way of going about things, which may not be helpful to you. Underneath that is a stuck image. So our lives are full of associations and images that are trying to have a conversation with us, but because we've already decided what the story is, we've shut down the inquiry. How do we access these images? We can't get there using the tools of logic and rationality and interpretation. We need the tools of the artist, which is metaphor and narrative and music. So if you can access the image and have a conversation with it using the tools of the artist, all this new information arrives because, as we've seen, the creative mind has deep roots into the unconscious, into what we don't know about our own lives. And that's immensely helpful for us to heal, for us to rethink the story we've been telling ourselves about our own lives, start writing our stories rather than feeling a victim of our stories. And I know it's easy to say that because some people have suffered too much. But if you are able to access and work with these images, it can change your relationship with your own story, your relationship with your own life. I need to also insert here something that Jaak Panksepp, a neuroscientist, spent his whole life exploring, which he called the 7 primary emotional systems of the brain. You know, a lot of people say, I'm not creative, I can't do this. But as we know, that our dreams are our most creative part of our lives, really. So he discovered that there are 7 emotional systems that we have to be born with. We can't learn them because we would die before we've learned them. We have to be born with these neural circuits for survival. And one of them is play. We can't learn how to play because we need to be able to play in order to learn. So what we are doing here when we get into the artistic brain and the creative brain is that we are playing in order to learn about our lives, about ourselves, about our habits, so that we can enrich our lives and expand our lives and enjoy our lives more, because play is an enjoyable behavior, even when you're working with something that is really can be very traumatic and very difficult. Through my own practice and through working with many, many writers over 10 years in the Life Writing Collective, and through doing research with Professor Steve Reed of the University of Cape Town, we're busy compiling this research at the moment, we've come up with many, many benefits of regular creative practice, writing practice. And the first one, I've grouped them here, the first one that's really important is to overcome the inner critic. Because that undermining voice that we all carry in our heads, isn't it interesting that it doesn't matter what your background is, how privileged you've been, or how what difficult circumstances you've grown up in, we all carry this voice that says we're not good enough and we're a fraud and people are going to laugh at us. So overcoming that inner critic is the first step to be able to even pick up your pen or pick up a paintbrush or cut up some magazines to do a collage. You have to be able to value your own process. And that's one of the things that we help people to do in the courses. We also help people transform hope and fear, that trap, into curiosity, to step into the creative brain and expand the story. You discover your own capacity and resilience as you face the thing that maybe that you have been avoiding for years. Of course, there is a right time to do this. I don't advocate breakthrough therapies, and we never force people to go where they are not ready to go. There is a right time. We have defenses in place for good reason. But when it's the right time to explore your own story, your own life story, it can change your relationship with that story in a way that will help you for the rest of your life. This is a life resource that is available to anyone, to everyone. So once you have overcome that inner critic and grown compassion for your own story and grown some confidence, it helps you to get insight into your own process. It gives a shape to your distress. While you're feeling anxious and it's in your body, it's this blur. Once you get it out onto the page or onto the canvas or onto the dance floor, you can start giving it some kind of shape. And then the amazing thing is that it starts talking back to you in ways that you could not have imagined in your own head. It's got to be out in the world for it to start having this conversation with you. And then you become more observant and more mindful, because that's what curiosity does. It makes you pay attention. What's going to happen next? So it transforms that uncertainty of, I know what's going to happen next and it's terrible, and you get caught in the hope, fear trap, into, whoa, what's going to happen next? I don't know that, but that's surprising. You start surprising yourself. And then that supports change and healing. It assists you to debrief from your own trauma, because you get curious about it rather than getting trapped by it. It allows you to try out options in what Shanzhou calls the virtual workspace of the mind. So instead of having a perception, making the association and the interpretation and reacting in the world, you have the perception, you play with it in the virtual workspace of the creative mind, And then you can choose options in the world. Am I going to respond like this? Am I going to respond like that? Because now you know more about your own habits and tendencies. It also helps you to grow community, because sharing your work with others, overcoming that critic, also allows you to share your work with others so that you can get considered, respectful feedback, not the undermining voice that you carry in your own head. So growing community helps you to bear witness both of your own life story and other people's life stories. So you get to know other people's stories, and you might have had all sorts of associations about the man with the moustache or whoever it is that you find are absolutely untrue about this man with the moustache, or that person who comes from a different culture, or that person who is old or young. You know, it cuts across all the things that all the prejudices that we carry about ourselves and about each other. So just to stress, this is an innate and free resource, and regular creative practice, if you can learn to value your own process, is a birthright. To illustrate the power of this work, I want to tell you quickly the story of the monitor lizard. So I worked with a woman once. She came to a writing course, and she wrote, and she had all sorts of issues in her life that she was really struggling to deal with in various areas. She had a creative block, she had a relationship difficulty, she had health problems, and she was frozen with anxiety. And she then, with assistance, with support, wrote the story about when she was a little girl going to her grandparents' farm, and they used to go down to the river to swim and play, she and her cousins. And then one of the farmers, her grandfather was a farmer, one of his neighbors said, you shouldn't let the children go down to the river because there are monitor lizards there. These are huge lizards, and they're dangerous, and the children will get frightened. And the grandfather said, no, they're harmless creatures. They won't do any harm to the children. So they carried on playing at the river, and then one day they were down at the river bank. They'd swum across the river, they were at the river bank, and they saw these boys throwing mud balls at the holes where the monitor lizards lived. And they said to the boys, don't do that, you know, they're sweet creatures. And the boys turned around and started throwing mud balls at these little girls. And the narrator of the story, this writer of the story, she got into the river and she started swimming back to the other bank, very anxious. And she turned around to see what the boys were doing, and a mud ball hit her in her face, and she couldn't see. She had sand in her eyes. She was terrified she was going to be blind forever, and she couldn't see where to go, where to swim. And she was a little girl, the big river. And then suddenly she felt this presence underneath her, and she knew it was a monitor lizard, and it guided her to the bank. This was her experience. And remembering that story gave her the courage to feel that she does have support. It's unseen. By the way, her eyes were sorted out and she didn't lose her sight, but she realized that in her anxiety there is something that is helping her, that she can rely on to take charge of her life and make very difficult decisions in all these areas, and because she got connected with her own creativity. I also want to tell you the story of Michaela. I gave this talk, or a similar talk, at a medical humanities conference, and afterwards a mother came to me and she said, I've got to tell you about my little girl who was born with cystic fibrosis. And she had, it was an illness of the lungs where there's a problem with surfactant. These children get lots of infections, and it's a very anxiety-provoking illness, both for the child and for obviously the whole family system. So this child every winter would have many, many illnesses. She'd be on antibiotics all the time. She'd have missed lots of school. And the mother, for some reason, and I forget that part of the story, one day she was again in bed on antibiotics, ill, struggling for breath. She gave her a tray with some clay on it and some paints. And this little girl created these wonderful images. And to me, this little girl and her mother, to me, that little girl, it's hard to say whether she's struggling for breath or singing. And the mother reported that once she got involved with creative activity, first of all, her breathing slowed down. She wasn't distressed. She lost her anxiety. She unmentored or undirected, she created these images that spoke directly to her condition and calmed her and her illness was shorter. She got better faster. She was back at school quicker. So we need to remember this as parents as well, that creative projects help our children explore and manage their anxieties in the most interesting way. Here's a quote from Michael Rosen, who's a children's author. Anyone who's a writer knows that you have the moment of the encounter, whatever it is, and then when you write about it, to make it safe for yourself, there's a way in which you turn it into something else. It's very hard to describe, but I know about it in relation to the death of my son. If you write about it, you put it outside of yourself. So here's the second half of the poem written by Glenn Colquhoun. Today I want to be a doctor. Today I am happy to be a doctor. Everyone seems to be getting better. Those who were sick are not so sick. Those who were well are thriving. The healthy are grateful to be alive, and the dying are at peace with their dying. No one has taken too many pills. No one has taken too few. A woman is returning to her husband. A husband is returning to his wife. The lame accept chairs. The blind ask for dogs. The deaf are listening to music. The depressed are tapping their feet. The asthmatics have stopped smoking. The alcoholics have stopped drinking. The diabetics are eating apples. The mad are beginning to make sense. Nobody's cholesterol is high. Disease has gone weak at the knee. I expect him to make an appointment. So this is our website, the Life Writing Collective. Please visit it. On the website are more stories of people who have written out of their experience and often resolved their trauma by writing about it. And you'll also find information about our audio course online and other courses. You can sign up for our newsletter and get information about real courses in real spaces. Once we get those going, we also have online courses. And we have also follow-up gatherings. So once you've done a course, you can continue to be supported by our organization, meeting once a month to share what you've written for your own and other people's benefit and pleasure. So here's a couple of examples or quotes from people who've done the course. Just to finish off, I'm just going to read a few. You can read them in your own time. Doing the course opened me to emotions I didn't realize I have and made me look at some parts of my life with a different eye. I arrived in substantial physical pain, and I'm leaving much. I'm in the way. I've come home to myself after a very long and arduous journey, with relief, healing, and comfort. The image of the course is of holding tight to the golden thread that will allow us to go down to the depths and emerge again unscathed, though not unchanged. The practice of creative writing has had a consistent, profoundly therapeutic effect on my life, my physical and psycho-emotional well-being. Thank you for attending. I hope you join us.